Hello and welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. My name is Jennifer White and I am your host today. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series for the whole church. We faithfully focus on care and education for the people of God and create opportunities to digitally worship together as the whole of the United Church of Christ. From prayer, music, and psalms to interviews of key leaders and how-tos for congregational life, this series stays current to the relevant topics of the time and offers opportunities of connection in the wider church and in your community. Together, we can bring our church in the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. We gather every Thursday with new conversations and topics as inspired by your questions and comments. As always, we are thankful for your presence, your gifts, and your questions. Thank you for being with us all along the way. Some upcoming sessions. Thursday, June 23rd at the same time, 3:30 Eastern, Manual on Church update. Join Reverend Dr. Chris Davies and members of the Manual on Church working group for a conversation on where we have been and where we are going with the document of best practices and covenantal connections. Attendees of this conversation will get a sneak peek into the newly developed Marks of Faith and Vital Congregations and be invited into the trials of how will this work for your setting? Thursday, June 30th, we'll have an afternoon of theater with Just Peace Players. The Just Peace Players are a group of interfaith religious leaders who write and perform plays on peace and justice themes. They perform live and virtually for local congregations and associations, gathering throughout the New England area and beyond. Join us as the Just Peace Players perform and discuss their ministries for the wider church and interfaith communities. As usual, you can visit ucc.org or any of our social media platforms to find out about upcoming sessions like this. Friends, beloveds, if conversations like this move you, if what's offered here enhances your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your prayerful and financial support help programs just like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you for all that you do. Today, we will focus on one of the 12 Just World Covenant programs of the United Church of Christ. One of the 12 programs will happen the third Thursday of each month at the same time. Today, we have Open and Affirming, the Power of Covenant. We'll share best practices we've learned from growing ONA churches, including intersectional advocacy and ways a church can design an ONA conversation that builds consensus and strengthens relationships. Friends, let me introduce you to Andy. Hi, Andy.
Jennifer, wonderful to see you. And it's great to see all of you. It's an honor for me to be here with Roberto and Vicky and Mike for this conversation about open and affirming covenants. I am Andy Lang, and I'm the Executive Director of the Open and Affirming Coalition of the United Church of Christ. I've had that role for about 12 years, and I'm fairly close to retirement at the end of this year, at least retirement from my current role in the coalition. And I'll just some truth in advertising. It's a very hot day here in Cleveland, and my air conditioning has not been installed yet. So all my windows are open, and occasionally you may hear a loud noise of a heavy truck rumbling on the potholes that are part of Cleveland's landscape. So if you do hear that loud noise in the background, please bear with me. So I want to talk a little bit about covenants and what they mean in the context of local congregations. We are the largest and fastest growing welcoming church movement, LGBTQ welcoming church movement in the world. And a lot of churches in the UCC are alive today that would have died a long time ago if they hadn't adopted an ONA covenant 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. But our primary goal is not to save churches. An ONA covenant does have that impact on many churches because a well-designed open and affirming experience for a local church can build energy and reduce the risk of conflict and show new ways of living faithfully in times of disagreement. But its primary purpose, of course, Here comes the truck. The primary purpose is to help congregations live more deeply into the gospel, to rediscover new ways to live according to the gospel, according to their beliefs in Jesus Christ, in their community at this time in our history. Our goal is that congregations will not be divided or weakened or in conflict at the end of the ONA process, but rather they will be more unified than ever before, and they will have more energy and passion for living out the gospel. The word covenant first shows up in the original Open and Affirming resolution that General Synod adopted in 1985. That's the resolution that assigned responsibility for building and resourcing and financing the Open and Affirming movement to the coalition. And specifically, the resolution asked congregations to adopt open and affirming covenants. Covenant was the word they used. But somehow, over the following years, that word got sidelined, and congregations tended to adopt open and affirming statements and declarations and policies and amendments to bylaws. And those are all good things, except they really express only the outward form and not the inner substance of a covenant. A covenant is something from our rich tradition, and it is based on Hebrew scripture, on the idea of a close, intimate, faithful relationship between the people and God. Covenants aren't just contracts or mission statements, but they're vows that a community makes in the presence of God as a result of listening to God's word, of trying to discern together God's purpose for the congregation, if you will, God's plan for the congregation. Because I know that's old-fashioned and maybe evangelical language, but I truly believe that God has a plan for every congregation in the United Church of Christ, and that plan is not decline, but vitality, growth, and more spirit. So about 10, 12 years ago, the coalition discovered, or rather rediscovered the word covenant, and that's become the centerpiece really of our programming since then. The idea is that we want congregations to essentially arrive at a declaration of faith and a commitment to follow God's ways in areas of their life that they could never have imagined possible before the ONA process. And covenant, I think, is a key to the transformation and revival of existing ONA churches. We need that revival. 60% of ONA churches tell us that they are not trans-friendly. The specific question was, can you offer a well-informed and confident welcome to your transgender and non-binary neighbors? And 60% said no. So we have a long way to go before our movement is truly open and affirming. And we have a long way to go before the UCC is an open and affirming denomination. Right now, 33%, 34%, as of last week, of our churches are open and affirming, and that's the fastest growing and largest LGBTQ welcoming church movement in the world, but 34% is not 100%. So we have a long way to go before the words United Church of Christ on a church sign anywhere in the country means this is a place, you LGBTQ seekers, this is a place where you and your family are safe. One of the principles of the open and affirming process is called gracious engagement. Vicki helped develop that concept years ago, and I quickly fell in love with it. It is an ecumenical, principle that we developed together with our partners in other churches. And I think it has particularly resonance for us, those of us who can trace part of our history to the Reformed tradition in Protestant Christianity. Because in our tradition, or in that tradition, grace is the self-giving of God. Grace is what God does for us. And God's grace is generous, radical, and liberating. And God's grace calls us into community where we can be graceful to others. That's the graceful part of graceful engagement. Engagement means that we choose to stay in relationship even when conflict threatens to separate us. So graceful engagement as the foundation for an ONA experience means that we accept each other as God accepts us. We forgive each other as God forgives us, and we remain faithful to each other as God is faithful to us. This is a tool that can help congregations navigate the difficult waters of an open and affirming process in ways that do not divide the congregation, that do not exclude or shame anyone in the congregation, but in ways that give new life to the church. And then finally, I want to say that an open and affirming process is not hierarchical. The coalition is not imposing our values or our beliefs on local churches. A healthy, open and affirming commitment always arises from within the congregation's existing history, culture, way of doing things, and beliefs. It arises from the congregation and it does not descend from above. So the power of ONA covenants also means that open and affirming churches across the board are healthier than non-ONA churches. Again, the purpose of our movement is not to make churches healthier, but that is one of the effects. We've done the research with the UCC's research office, and on average, we've discovered that ONA churches have higher membership rates, higher incomes, higher worship attendance, and attract more new members than non-ONA churches. So, how am I doing on time? I forgot to turn on my stopwatch. Well, anyway, I'll just go on for a couple more minutes. The last thing I want to say is that open and affirming covenants are inherently intersectional. And I think that'll come up when we talk in the second half of this program, when we talk about the future of ONA churches. I've never seen an ONA covenant that wasn't intersectional. And that meant it commits certainly the congregation to welcome, accept, and support their LGBTQ neighbors and members. But more than that, no ONA covenant does not mention race, does not mention age, does not mention ability. Many ONA covenants welcome people living with mental illness and cognitive disabilities. Open and affirming covenants are expansive and intersectional. And I tell churches when they're doing the work, don't feel that you've got to cover all those bases at the same time, because then your ONA process will last for 10 years. If you're going to do each of those communities the justice they deserve. But think of this expansive intersectional ONA covenant you're writing as a promissory note that you're making to yourself. And then later, reflect on ways that you can live into those other commitments that you've made. And the other covenant programs in the UCC are designed to give you the tools that you need to be able to take those steps. And then finally, I want to say that I always tell ONA churches that, first of all, they know what it is like to be a stranger. People in churches already know what it means to be a stranger, because every one of us has at one time or another been a stranger to ourselves, to our families, to our neighbors, to our community. We know what it's like to be a stranger, and that's why we know how important it is for the church to be capable of welcoming strangers into the community. That's pretty much all I want to say. I have no idea if I spoke over or under 20 minutes, but I want to hand this over now to Vicki. Vicki, could you introduce yourself?
All right, can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you, Andy. So my name is Vicki Wunsch. I am a ordained UCC and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I was hired with the Institute for Welcoming Resources about 10 years ago to develop sort of a welcoming church program for about 12 different denominations, I think it was. And a lot of the work that we designed came out of the Lutheran Church, but really sits with this idea of covenant. And so the idea was, how do we get churches to actually not necessarily focus on just, check mark, and then they put a sign up and say, we're welcoming, affirming, because we all know that that's probably going to do more harm than anything. And so how do churches go about actually doing a process that is authentic, that is real, that might be painful at times, but it actually involves more people in the church, not just the folks that we think have the power, folks that are going to agree with us and all that. So as Andy said, we talked about sort of what does this look like as far as community organizing within the church. Now, for those of you that know some community organizing tactics, they're a little bit more assertive or aggressive, and not in a bad way, but we know that probably doesn't work with churches so much. That the idea of being welcoming and affirming, and not only to become ONA, but to continue growing and continuing to look at who are you open and affirming to. So this term graceful engagement came out of a way to think about the most important thing in anything we do is the relationships. We know that churches are really good at relationships. And the other piece is that people have long-term relationships within the churches, and it takes a lot of trust in order to sort of follow through and talk about this process of becoming open and affirming, or really looking at any identity or statements that you're going to make in a church. So one of the things that I know, and I will pass this on, this isn't going to be a surprise for most of you, but there's a saying that says, you can't hate someone whose story you know. You can't hate someone whose story you know. And that's a really powerful piece in the groundwork of this graceful engagement. Because what we do is typically we would go up to somebody maybe and start a conversation about ONA, and it would often maybe start with, let's talk about what it means as far as, being gay and sin, or should we or church do weddings or things like that, or other ways that we enter into the conversation with other people to try to talk about becoming ONA, and all it does is polarize people. It's not a helpful framework. And so graceful engagement really takes the whole key, and I would say graceful engagement and some of the methods that we teach in it can benefit every church at all times in different ways, not just through this process. Because one of the methods about graceful engagement, if you're always keeping the relationship building first, one of the key things, and we'll be doing a training in October, is called the one-on-one conversation. And a one-on-one is something that is absolutely imperative to this, because what it is you're setting up a time to actually get to know people in the church. And I know that sounds kind of odd, but sometimes we can go to church for, with folks for a long time and not really know kind of where they stand totally on stuff, or not even know a lot about them. And so the one-on-one conversations that we want people to have are really about the relationship. And so they're not just starting a conversation saying, what do you think about homosexuality or things like that? It's really just, I want to get to know you. It's a graceful conversation. There isn't a hidden agenda, but it is a true organic process. And I say graceful, that really lets people understand and get to know each other. And because if you spend time actually on the relationship building piece, then you know that if there is fallout, if there are, discussions that might get heated or things like that, you go back to that, you don't hate somebody whose story you know. So I may be somebody that is not very open and affirming or something in the church, but if I'm hearing a story of somebody that I love, whose maybe son came out and they're struggling with what it is to be church, what it is to be a member of the church, but to also love their son, I'm going to be a little bit more warmer, maybe just a little bit more open to talking about this at some point, rather than sort of feeling this like opposition right away. So again, the relationship building is absolutely the key. So that kind of goes across all denominations that we've done this with, but I really think it resonates with the idea of covenant, that we are covenant with each other, and that at the end of the day, we're part of church together. And that is the most important thing here, is that we all love the church, and you can assume that people in congregations love their church too. And that's why this is always sometimes a heated kind of topic, or people get very passionate, but it is really about, because we all love the church, and what does that look like? So what I want to do now is just kind of open it up for a Q&A. I know it's kind of a lot that we are throwing out, but this is a whole training that we do several times throughout. Well, Andy can talk to that a little bit, but if you want to learn more, there's certainly a lot of resources out there. So.
Jennifer's reminding us that if we have questions, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen.
Probably helpful to know. One story about the grandma, and then the question about how do you deal with members who threaten to quit. I mean, I'll just say members are going to threaten to quit over changing the font in the bulletin. I mean, sometimes it's you're changing sort of what they know is church and things like that. And I don't mean to downplay it all, but that is kind of some of the reality of when there is any change. And that might happen. I think the idea is that you work through it. And if there is this threaten to quit, you kind of walk through it. What does it look like? Why is this such a heated thing? And Andy can speak to this too, but the way that we do this with the graceful engagement piece is that it invites that person in. It doesn't, it's sort of what we would think was, well, this person is against this, so let's not invite that person to conversation or anything like that. They're just going to quit anyway. But it's really inviting them in an authentic way. It's saying, I want to hear about this more, and kind of dig at what is so fearful, or what is it about this whole process that is so affecting them that they're threatening to quit? Because there could be lots of underlying reasons.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that the one-to-one conversation tool, which we do provide training for, is an effective way to bring people who may be skeptical or even oppositional into the conversation. It's not about just talking at them or giving them a program or preaching a sermon. It's about trying to bring them into relationship. And sometimes that means that people who otherwise would opt out of everything that happens in the ONA process will find themselves involved because they've been treated with respect and they've been addressed by name, and we have listened to them. Phil, you asked a question, help me understand moving from the long struggle of becoming ONA to adding more to the covenant. So Phil, first of all, our program is designed so that ONA is not a struggle. It is in some congregations, I know that, but generally they tend to be congregations that haven't used our resources and have plunged into the ONA process as if it were just another program, when in reality it's an opportunity for revival. It's an opportunity to rediscover our love of God and neighbor. It's a revival experience for the church. So ONA doesn't have to be a struggle, and most of the churches that we work with aren't really struggling. Some are, there's no question about it. And there are definitely congregations that exist in hostile environments where attitudes within the church have been so polarized, as the whole country has been polarized in the past several years. So that can be a struggle too. But we want ONA to be a carefully designed process that leads the congregation to stronger and better relationships. And congregations generally, when they adopt a covenant, already write it so that it's intersectional. They're not adding anything to it. I never see an ONA covenant that doesn't include, besides sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, also race and age. And as I said before, people living with cognitive disabilities or brain injuries or mental health challenges. Sometimes covenants commit the church to welcome returning veterans from our wars. Our advice has been, you digest your commitment to LGBTQ inclusion first, see how that's going, and then look at those other commitments, and those resources are available from the UCC, and the coalition certainly can direct people in that direction.
I think the other piece of it is to really, there's so much power in language, and I have seen it helpful to say we're starting the process of looking at what it looks like to explore this. I mean, there is this the process is so much more important than the end result, even though we're really tied to that end result. But really looking at the process, which means, we're not going in saying, well, we're going to vote on to become ONA, so the vote is going to happen here. Now we're going to, do whatever we can to get through it, sort of thing. And to know that taking time with the process, even if for those of you that are part of ONA churches already, it is an ongoing piece. Like at different times, you might find, wow, I thought we went through this process, but, now somebody asked to get married in the church, or now there is a trans person, or whatever that might be, that challenges sort of that idea. And what you've done then already is lay the groundwork for having some kind of base of relationship building after going through the process of becoming ONA.
Thank you. Tom Davidson has asked, being safe isn't being greeted as you want. It's the congregation's willingness to accept how you want to be greeted. Well, yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think you might be referring to gender identity and transgender, non-binary experiences. And we find that that's an essential part of the conversation that happens when ONA churches, or churches begin to move towards an ONA covenant. And one thing I've also learned is that, it's an old principle on organizing, not about us, without us. I don't know any congregation that has successfully had a learning experience and expanded their minds and hearts about differing gender identities and expressions that has not been in dialogue with their transgender and non-binary members. So the other thing is that a very practical way that congregations can encourage people to identify their gender so that we don't make assumptions is very simple. This takes some time. The congregation's not going to warm up to this right away, but just encourage members of the church to put their preferred pronouns on their ID tag, so that people of differing gender identities and expressions who come into your church know that you're not making assumptions.
I'm going through now. I see the questions more, so going through all.
And it looks like we're nearing the end of Q&A. These are all great questions. Why do we need to fly a rainbow flag? The percentage of ONA churches is 34%. The actual number is about 1,700. And the rest of the questions, I'm going to make a note of these. And my email address is ed for executive director. My name is not Ed. ed@openaffirming.org. And if you wanted to follow up on any of these questions, I'd love to be in conversation with you.
And I'd be resource as well. So yes, but I will say that the curriculum, the Building a Welcoming Church curriculum that the UCC that we have, it really goes through. I mean, it was fine-tooth comb by 12 different denomination people and has been revised. So it's not perfect, but it really does have as many resources as we could think of to sort of get it. But it's sort of just a start too. So this was a 3-day training that we did. So getting it all now.
One more question. I'm wondering, Jennifer, if when you send out more resources after this meeting to those who attended, if maybe we'd have a chance to respond to some of those questions. That's a possible option.
Absolutely. I will make sure that this group of panelists gets a list of the Q&A so they can get back to folks where appropriate.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I will pass it on to Roberto and Michael.
Hello, everyone, and good to be with you. And I think that we may have a chance to provide some information for some of the questions that are in the Q&A already, as well as we share today. And Roberto, it's certainly good to be with you today. I know Roberto is traveling, so he's joining us via Zoom from his car. And we're going to have a little conversation here about Open and Affirming. And so my name is Mike Schenemeyer. I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and I serve in the national setting as the minister and team leader for health and wholeness advocacy. I won't go through my whole portfolio because we'll run out of time, but one of the areas of focus that I have is on LGBTQ ministries and also on HIV and AIDS ministries. Those are things that I really truly give legs to. And Roberto, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure, it's good to be with you, Michael, and good to be with everybody, Vicky. And I'm Roberto. I too am an ordained as the Minister for Ethnic Inclusion and Congregational Support for Rural and Small Churches. And prior for coming to Nashville, I was a pastor for 7 years of an Open and Affirming small church in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I served as an ONA task force member for about 12 years in the former Massachusetts conference. So it's great being here with you, Mike.
Great. Roberto, I know you have some experience with the open and affirming process, and I wonder both in terms as a pastor and also in your role on the national staff, what are some of the things that you've seen or experienced, some of the trends that you're noticing about open and affirming?
So the good news is, especially when we're talking about ethnic identified and congregations of color, we are way than say 10.
You're breaking up just a little bit, Roberto, and the connection's a little
Oh,
sketchy, but just try
I,
starting that again because we weren't quite getting it.
uh, I hope this connection holds. I apologize. So, what I was saying is that we are much better off today than we were about 10 years ago in our ethnic identified communities, congregations of color, and our rural congregations. So that's the good news. I think what I find is that Vicky said it really well, is that for many of our smaller churches, our ethnic identified churches, our congregations of color, we need to, they have nuances when it comes with relationships. So someone's asking me to turn off. I'm going to turn off my video to see if that works better. I hope that works better, that you can hear me and not break up. So, so I think what we're seeing is a trend of first and second generation ethnic identified UCCers that are bringing the message of inclusivity, open and affirming, to their churches, and we're seeing an openness. Is this any better, Michael?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So,
Everyone just has to put
so
up with my mug. That's all.
okay. Well, you're a better looking mug anyway.
Yeah.
So, so I think this is where in small churches and in ethnic identified churches work more like family systems, and so this is where relationships are very important and key when approaching the questions of open and affirming. Indeed, there have been many congregations that have begun having open and affirming or accepting inclusivity, thinking they were, but didn't realize that there was a process. So even though Andy said that there were officially 34% of our denomination, my guess is that number is higher. We have a lot more congregations that, even though they haven't acted open and affirming, that they haven't officially become open and affirming, are.
Yeah,
And of course, when I do my work, I do encourage them to reach out to open and affirming because it matters. It's really important.
I agree with you, Roberto. And someone was also asking, there are folks who say informally, well, we're really ONA or kind of ONA spirited. Why do we have to go through the ONA process? And I think what you just talked about is what's really important, because open and affirming really is a learning journey. It's not just about what you say you are. It's also about how you continue to learn, and then how you decide as a community that you want to express your values together as a community. That's why the covenant is so important. And it's important that if you're going to express welcome and inclusion, that you have a depth of understanding about what that means. I know a lot of congregations, when they develop their open and affirming covenants, they put everything in the kitchen sink in them. And because they truly want to express that kind of wide, extravagant welcome. But I think it's so important that if you're going to put something in your open and affirming covenant, that you're willing to do the deep dive and really try to understand, what does it mean for us to offer this kind of a welcome with this population of people who share this identity. And we all have many identities. So there's ways in which folks show up in all of their identities. So it's important for folks to adopt a covenant that they're willing to take the deep dive into.
Yeah, for instance, like, as you oversee a ministry in the Latinx context in Cuentos, which is headed by Reverend Rena Ramos, they take the same thing and they about the intersectionality of how marginalization may affect us ethnically, equally, spiritually, and how works with the LGBTQ communities. So that's one, for instance, where the conversations is digging deep and having the relationships and creating that, from the nuances of cultural context. Because that is that cultural context approach issues of sexuality, are much more complicated.
Right. And that is a project that exists under the Health and Wholeness Advocacy Office, and Rena is doing really incredible work
She's
there.
doing an
And we'll
amazing
make sure
job.
that we share the link to that in the resources that we share after this webinar, because people will be able to access a toolkit and for the work there. And this project is not just for congregations that are predominantly Latinx, it's for congregations that are seeking to serve people in their congregation who have Latinx identity, and no matter
Right.
how many those people may be. So it's not just about resourcing Latinx pastors, it's resourcing all of our pastors and leaders in the United Church of Christ as well. And there's a robust coaching project that we currently have going. And if people are interested in receiving coaching, they can be in touch with Rena, and I'll put Rena's email in the chat as well when I get a break from my talking so you can be in touch with her about how you might access the coaching program that currently exists. Also wanted
A great development has happened in the Council on Racial and Ethnic Ministries, Quorum.
Yes.
Quorum. For instance, there's a convocation happening at the end of June, and they have created space for us to look at open and affirming, which is a big step, which is the first time that the whole council will be able to be addressing about, importance of the open and affirming. To that degree, I'm pleased to announce that the Chinese Congregational Church, a congregation that's 143 years old from in San Francisco, a member of PAM, which is the Pacific Islander and Asian American Ministries, just became open and affirming officially on Pentecost Sunday. So, so we're seeing more of that. So I'm excited about that.
Yes, that is exciting. I think we're seeing an uptick in the opportunities to have conversations and to help support the development of resources that are culturally relevant to the various racial ethnic communities that we have in the United Church of Christ. I also want to share that ONA is a journey of living into a covenant, so that when a setting becomes ONA, that's a milestone event. But then they begin the work of meaningfully living into that covenant. And so hopefully, as part of your process of becoming an open and affirming church, you're having a conversation about what it means for you, what it will mean for you to live into those values, how you can actively and intentionally offer, welcome, and engage in inclusive practices. So there are symbolic gestures that you can make. That's the signs and the banners and the language. And some people want to know, well, why do we have to put a sign out there? Why is that so important? Well, I can tell you that most people know or may suspect that there are open and affirming settings. There's an open and affirming church that might welcome them, but they may not know how to find that church. And these signs and gestures and symbols are so important to helping people do that. Imagine showing up at a hotel and going to the front desk, and they give you the key card, but they don't tell you what the room number is. So now you
Right,
got to
for
go
sure.
to all those different rooms and figure out, try to find the one that is going to open for you. So in creating these symbolic gestures, you're providing the room number for that key card of open and affirming, so that when somebody comes to the church, they know the kind of welcome that this door is going to open for them. And that's one of the important things about using signs. I know one church was in conflict over that, and actually a gay couple actually ended up leaving the church because they didn't want the rainbow symbol on the church's placard. The very next Sunday after they put it up, the rainbow sign up, a heterosexual couple showed up with a couple of kids, and they ended up joining the church. When they asked why they were joining the church, they said, "We saw the rainbow sign on your church door, and we knew that that was the kind of church and the values that we wanted for our family." So it isn't that people aren't going to disagree, and some people might fall out over it. It is that offering the welcome is meaningful in the community, and it communicates the values of the kind of church that you want to be. And I think that's so important to try to understand. I also know that there's, no, I get going and I get on my soapbox, so I need to pause on that.
Michael, but to your point, Michael, is no different is that if you have a ministry reaching out to a ethnic community where different language, you want to say it in Spanish or in English or that if you have a ministry active ministry, by doing that outward sign, it tells the community that not only are you a welcoming space, but you're a safe space as well. So, having those symbols, because that's part of the covenancy, is understanding the trauma and the pain that has been caused on our communities in the name of church. And so, and not only for the LGBTQ person, but for our families. Our families want to go in together to be able to knowing that that they can invite a gay or lesbian, bi, transgender, queer family member or child, and that they were going to be welcome there.
Exactly. Yep. The other thing that I was that I want to make sure to convey is that many times churches that are open and affirming find ways to take actions to be in solidarity with people who experience marginalization in their communities. Certainly around issues of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, but also in terms of other items or areas of marginalization as well. We know that over the past several months that people of trans and non-binary experience have really been under the gun, and issues around sexual orientation have also been before a lot of state legislatures. And this month could be a month in which we can show folks a lot of support and solidarity. Over the last few days, we've just been posting a number of resources to help congregations provide that support and solidarity. And you will find those resources at ucc.org/trans. Among them is a pastoral letter which was just recently released that was signed on to by the conference ministers of this denomination, the Council of Conference Ministers, and our UCC officers, as well as the coalition. I think it's a powerful letter, and you'll find it at that website that I just mentioned, ucc.org/trans. You'll also find there a campaign called the Beloved by God campaign. And this is a video campaign in which we are inviting allies and people of trans and non-binary experience to offer 30 to 60-second videos that express solidarity, support, compassion, love with our trans and non-binary family. many of you may be familiar with the It Gets Better campaign, and so it's in that same spirit. And so I hope you'll have a look at those resources, have a look at the campaign. We have a number of videos that are already up on the Vimeo UCC channel that you can look at. And there's a link on the website for you to get to those videos. And you can use those in your worship. You can use them to share on social media. And you can use them as, kind of a reference for the kinds of messages that we hope others will be sharing, and that they will post on social media to help us express this solidarity and support as broadly and as widely as we can. I think that this is one of the ways in which individuals as well as congregations can give a public witness to the open and affirming values that they have. And it is a way to live out that open and affirming covenant. I know, Roberto, there's a lot of things in the chat, but before we, in the Q&A, but before we get to that, I want to see if there's anything else that you want to make sure that you share with us today as well.
One thing that I'd like to share is that the growing trend of our rural congregations, who because of the current situations are doing their best, and that we need to remember them in our prayers, because most of our rural congregations, UCC, are really approaching open and affirming, thoughtfully, and often are the safe spaces in their communities that are often hostile. So I think there's a lot of movement there, and that supporting our rural congregations is really important.
Right. I know it is a growing trend, and we've seen an uptick of ONA settings in among rural churches. And I think that's exciting to see. There are a couple of questions here. Trying to look and read and stay engaged at the same time. And I would invite Andy and Vicki back too to help us respond to some additional questions that are here. There's a question that was asked around kind of translating the hate over homosexuality into the love of God, and how do we get others to understand that God's love, God loves us all as his children. That is one of the foundational statements that the General Synod has made. I believe it was 1975, the General Synod made a pronouncement, which is the strongest statement a General Synod makes about discrimination in employment in particular was what it was addressing, but supporting civil rights is the language that they were using at the time. And in that, they made the statement that every person as a child of God has worth and dignity given to them by God that human judgment cannot set aside. I paraphrased it a little bit, not the exact quote from that, but that's the gist of the statement. And that is a foundational statement, I think, that almost any faith could get behind, that every person has worth and dignity that human judgment cannot set aside. It is the foundation of human rights. It is the foundation from which we create the spaces that are safer for people to have conversations about human sexuality. And it's spaces that's even enabling us to share a document encouraging human sexuality conversations at the World Council of Churches at their assembly coming up in Karlsruhe, Germany later this year. And this is a place that has incredible diversity of theological perspectives, including the Russian Orthodox, who are very conservative and resistant to these kinds of conversations. And yet they've been part of the reference group on human sexuality that has helped to put this document together and is bringing it to the World Council of Churches. I think when we ground ourselves in those kinds of values, we can do incredible work. The other thing I would say is the values of the Our Whole Lives curriculum also provide the values for doing this kind of work as well, because it's grounded in self-worth, in responsibility, in sexual health, in justice and inclusion. Those are the core values of the Our Whole Lives curriculum. And when we speak through those values, we can transform the messages of hate into the messages of love.
And I would say too, the other good framework to use is something that is beloved by your own congregation even. What is your mission statement? What is your tagline? What is something that people sort of already kind of tie themselves to? And so whatever that might be, that's a really good way to sort of look at, okay, how do we live this out? Whatever that might be. How do we have this conversation about ONA as far as it relates to what something is already so dear and near to the identity of the church, and something that people have come up with together at some point in time. And that's it's a good framework to use for having these conversations, because sometimes I think also we can get focused on the others. So welcoming others in, and like, we want to make sure that those people are, that want to come to our church are welcome, but this is really about our church as well. So internally, who are we? And so going back to the, who are we as a church? What do we believe already? What are those key things that are important to our congregation, that are really helpful things to always remind ourselves, because it's what ONA is living that out.
There's another question that I would like to respond to, and that is to do with, do you often see conversations continue even after an ONA covenant is accepted by a church if there are still people who are struggling with becoming open and affirming? In other words, do you see the graceful engagement continue? And I think the answer to that should be yes. I don't know if it always is, but I think that congregations are able. And one of the things I really like about the Building an Inclusive Toolkit is it has a tool in there that helps people kind of understand what pace should we go at. So it's a bit of an assessment, a series of questions that congregations can do that helps them to sense, well, what's the culture of our congregation like, and what pace should we go at? Because we know that this is in some ways a developmental process for folks. So it's not just about the information that people receive or the advocacy that happens. It's also about the time, because we all need time to kind of digest and process things. So you don't do things all at once. We know some congregations get through the open and affirming process in 6 months. It takes others 2 years or longer to do it, but they stick to it, they kind of get at it, and they do it as the process enables them to move forward. And I think the important message here is don't give up. Continue to have the conversations, continue to engage with grace and love.
I think there was a question about the Building an Inclusive Toolkit, and I'm wondering if it has been made available, or if we can tell people where it would be.
I'll do that in the chat room.
Super.
There was a question about the difference between building an inclusive church and building a welcoming church. And I would love, if this were like a normal conversation, we're face to face with each other, I'd love to engage in that. But I can say that to me, when I hear the word welcoming, sometimes to me, it seems like a very weak word. We think of welcome as being friendly to somebody, handing them a bulletin at the church door, smiling. And that kind of friendliness is obviously very important. But in Paul's letter to the Romans, I think it's chapter 15, verse 7, he uses, and this is translated as welcome in the NRSV, he says, welcome one another just as Christ has welcomed you to give praise to God. But actually the verb that Paul uses, the Greek verb, means to take, in exactly the same sense that sometimes we use that word in our marriage vows. I take you to be my husband, I take you to be my wife, I take you to be my spouse. So Paul is asking for more than a welcome. He's asking for us to be in a close, intimate relationship with each other. And I think that really is the essence of the Open and Affirming movement.
There's a question about finding the statement that I paraphrased earlier, and I'm going to send you a link that is to all, at least to, I'm not sure if they're all quite up there yet, but to a history of LGBT statements from the General Synod and other national UCC bodies. And this is the statement that I referenced is from the one, the pronouncement on civil rights. And that I think that you'll find it under 1975. I think the other question in the chat around what symbol, which includes heterosexual people as well. There's kind of a couple of things. For one, the rainbow symbol is intended to be inclusive of everyone, and there is now an expanded kind of rainbow flag that not only has the 6 primary colors for the rainbow flag that is used for gay pride, but it also includes the pink, blue, and white colors that are used to symbolize the transgender community, and the black and brown colors that is intended to include racial diversity. And so there are samples of that flag that you'll find on the internet pretty readily if you simply do an image search on pride flags, and you'll find that expansive color flag pretty readily that way. And I think for Open and Affirming, we encourage the most inclusive use of those kinds of flags as your congregation would like to use. I know we're coming up on the end of our time for the webinar. I don't know if Roberto and Vicky and Andy have kind of final thoughts that they'd like to offer in just a brief few seconds. They're all giving the thumbs up. Well, Andy, I think we want to ask you if you could pray us out, and then I know Jennifer has some things to say just following that.
Yes, I'd be glad to, Mike. Thank you. As we center our hearts and minds now, we've had a time for conversation. What kinds of feelings may have been stirred up? We are learning more, but most of all, we want to be your followers, Jesus. We want to know your purpose for us in our lives. We want to know how to share with others the grace that you have given us. We want to know how we can recognize you in the face of everyone who is different. And so, Lord, show us your vision for our lives. Show us your vision for our congregations. And let us know that no matter how difficult the path or the struggle, you are always with us, our companion and guide. Amen.
Amen.
Dear siblings in Christ, if this conversation has inspired you, if what you heard here bless your heart and your ministry, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help programs like this and our essential work. Thank you for your support. Be blessed in the rest of your day, and know that we're holding you in prayer. Amen.